Chapter 9. Lucy as a work of art. A few days after the engagement was announced, Mrs. Honeychurch made Lucy and her fiasco come to a little garden party in the neighborhood, for naturally she wanted to show people that her daughter was marrying a presentable man. Cecil was more than presentable. He looked distinguished, and it was very pleasant to see his slim figure keeping step with Lucy, and his long, fair face responding when Lucy spoke to him. And people congratulated Mrs. Honeychurch, which is, I believe, a social blunder. But it pleased her, and she sort of introduced Cecil rather indiscriminately to some stuffy dowagers. At tea, a misfortune took place. A cup of coffee was upset over Lucy's figured silk, and though Lucy feigned indifference, her mother feigned nothing of the sort, but dragged her indoors to have the frock treated by a sympathetic maid. They were gone some time, and Cecil was left with the dowagers. When they returned, he was not as present as he had been. "Do you go to much of this sort of thing?" he asked when they were driving home. "Oh, now and then," said Lucy, who had rather enjoyed herself. "Is it typical of country society?" "I suppose so. Mother, would it be?" "Plenty of society," said Mrs. Honeychurch, who was trying to remember the hang of one of the dresses. Seeing that her thoughts were elsewhere, Cecil bent towards Lucy and said, "To me it seemed perfectly appalling, disastrous, portentous. I am so sorry that you are stranded." "Not that, but the congratulations. It is so disgusting. The way an engagement is regarded as public property, a kind of waste place where every outsider may shoot his vulgar sentiment. All those old women smirking. One has to go through it, I suppose. They won't notice us so much next time. But my point is that their whole attitude is wrong. An engagement, horrid word in the first place, is a private matter and should be treated as such. Yet, the smirking old women, however wrong individually, were racially correct. The spirit of the generations had smiled through them, rejoicing in the engagement of Cecil and Lucy because it promised the continuance of life on earth. To Cecil and Lucy, it promised something quite different. Personal love. Hence, Cecil's irritation and Lucy's belief that his irritation was just. "How tiresome," she said. "Wouldn't you have a skate to tennis?" "I don't play tennis, or at least not in public. The neighborhood is deprived of the romance of me being athletic. Such romance as I have is that of the Anglesey Italianata. Inglesi Italianata. Un diavolo incarnato. You know the proverb? She did not. Nor did it seem applicable to a young man who had spent a quiet winter in Rome with his mother. But Cecil, since his engagement, had taken to effect a cosmopolitan naughtiness, which he was far from possessing. "Well," said he, "I cannot help it if they do disapprove of me. There are certain irremovable barriers between myself and them, and I must accept them." "We all have our limitations, I suppose," said wise Lucy. Sometimes they are forced on us, though, said Cecil. He saw from her remark that she did not quite understand his position. How? It makes a difference, doesn't it? Whether we fully fence ourselves in or whether we are fenced out by the barriers of others. She thought a moment and agreed that it did make a difference. Difference? Cried Mrs. Honeychurch, suddenly alert. I don't see any difference. Fences are fences, especially when they are in the same place. We were speaking of motives, said Cecil, on whom the interruption jarred. My dear Cecil, look here. She spread out her knees and perched her card case on her lap. So this is me. That's Windy Corner. The rest of the pattern is the other people. Motives are all very well, but the fence comes here. We weren't talking of real fences, said Lucy, laughing. Oh, I see, dear. Poetry. He leant placidly back. Cecil wondered why Lucy had been amused. I tell you who has no fences, as he called them, she said, and that's Mr. Beebe. A parson fenceless would mean a parson defenseless. Lucy was slow to follow what people said, but quick enough to detect what they meant. She missed Cecil's epigram, there grasped the feeling that prompted it. Don't you like Mr. Beebe? Miss she asked thoughtfully. I never said so, he cried. I consider him far above the average. I only denied.
And he swept off on the subject of fences again. It was brilliant.
Now, a clergyman that I do hate, said she, wanting to say something sympathetic. A clergyman that does have fences, and the most dreadful ones, is Mr. Eager, the English chaplain at Florence. He was truly insincere. Not merely the manner. Unfortunate. He was a snob, and so conceited. And he did say such unkind things. What sort of things? There was an old man at the Bertolini, when you said had murdered his wife. Perhaps he had. No. Why? No. Well, he was such a nice old man, I'm sure. Cecil laughed at her feminine inconsequence. Well, I did try to sift the thing. Mr. Eager would never come to the point. He prefers it vague, said the old man had practically murdered his wife, had murdered her in the sight of God. Hush, dear, said Mrs. Honeychurch, absently. But isn't it intolerable that a person whom we're told to imitate should go round spreading slander? It was, I believe, chiefly owing to him that the old man was dropped. People pretended he was vulgar, but he certainly wasn't that. Poor old man. What was his name? Harris, said Lucy glibly. Let's hope that Mrs. Harris there. Warn't no sick person, said her mother. Cecil nodded intelligently. Isn't Mr. Neighbor, Eager, a parson of the cultured type? He asked. I don't know. I hate him. and I've heard him lecture on Jackto. I hate him. Nothing can hide a petty nature. I hate him. My goodness gracious me, child, said Mrs. Honeychurch. You'll bowl my head off. Whatever is there to shout over? I forbid you and Cecil to hate any more clergymen. He smiled. There was indeed something rather incongruous in Lucy's moral outburst over Mr. Eager. It was as if one should see the Leonardo on the ceiling of the Sistine. He longed to hint to her that not here lay her vocation, that a woman's power and charm reside in mystery, not in muscular rant. But possibly rant is a sign of vitality. It mars the beautiful creature, but shows that she is alive. After a moment, he contemplated her flushed face and excited gestures with a certain approval. He forbore to repress the sources of youth. Nature, simplest of topics, he thought, lay around them. He praised the pine woods, the deep laths of bracken, the crimson leaves that spotted the hurt bushes, the serviceable beauty of the turnpike road. The outdoor world was not very familiar to him, and occasionally he went wrong in a question of fact. Mrs. Honeychurch's mouth twitched when he spoke of the perpetual green of the larch. I count myself a lucky person, he concluded. When I'm in London, I feel I could never live out of it. When I'm in the country, I feel the same about the country. After all, I do believe that birds and trees in the sky are the most wonderful things in life, and that the people who live amongst them must be the best. It's true that in 9 cases out of 10, they don't seem to notice anything. The country gentleman and the country laborer are each in their way the most depressing of companions. Yet they may have a tacit sympathy with the workings of nature, which is denied to us of the town. Do you feel that, Mrs. Honeychurch? Mrs. Honeychurch started and smiled. She had not been attending. Cecil, who was rather crushed on the front seat of the Victoria, felt irritable and determined not to say anything interesting again. Lucy had not attended either. Her brow was wrinkled, and she still looked furiously cross. The result, he concluded, of too much moral gymnastics. It was sad to see her thus blind to the beauties of an August wood. Come down, O maid, from yonder mountain height, he quoted, and touched her knee with his own. She flushed again and said, What height? Come down, O maid, from yonder mountain height, with pleasure lives in height, the shepherd sang, in height and in the splendor of the hills. Let us take Mrs. Honeychurch's advice and hate clergymen no more. What's this place? Summer Street, of course, said Lucy, and roused herself. The woods had opened to leave space for sloping, triangular meadow. Pretty cottages lined it on 2 sides, and the upper and 3rd side was occupied by a new stone church, expensively simple, a charming shingled spire. Mr. Beebe's house was near the church. In height, it scarcely exceeded the cottages. Some great mansions were at hand, but they were hidden in the trees. The scene suggested a Swiss Alp rather than the shrine and center of a leisured world, and was marred only by two ugly little villas, the villas that had competed with Cecil's engagement, having been acquired by Sissy was the name of one of these villas, Albert of the other. These titles were not only picked out in shaded Gothic on the garden gates, but appeared a second time on the porches, where they followed the semicircular curve of the entrance arch in block capitals. Albert was inhabited. His tortured garden was bright with geraniums and lobelias and polished shells. His little windows were chastely swamped in Nottingham lace. Sissy was to let. 3 notice boards belonging to Dorking agents lolled on her fence and announced a not surprising fact. Her paths were already weedy. Her pocket handkerchief of a lawn was yellow with dandelions. The place is ruined, said the ladies mechanically. Summer Street will never be the same again. As the carriage passed, Sissy's door opened, and a gentleman came out of her. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Honeychurch, touching the coachman with her parasol. "Here's Sir Harry. Now we shall know." Sir Harry, pull those things down at once. Sir Harry Otway, who need not be described, came to the carriage and said, "Mrs. Honeychurch, I know too." "I can't. I really can't turn out Miss Black. Am I not always right? She ought to have gone before the contract was signed. Does she still live rent-free, as she did in her nephew's time? But what can I do?" He lowered his voice. "An old lady, so very vulgar and almost bedridden." "Turn her out," said Cecil, bravely. Sir Harry sighed and looked at the villas mournfully. He had had full warning of Mr. Flack's intentions, and might have bought the plot before building commenced, but he was apathetic and dilatory. He had known Summer Street for so many years that he could not imagine it being split. Not till Mrs. Flack had laid the foundation stone, and the apparition of red and cream brick began to rise, did he take alarm. He called on Mr. Flack, the local builder, a most reasonable and respectful man, who agreed that tiles would have made more artistic loof, but pointed out that slates were cheaper. He ventured to differ, however, about the Corinthian columns, which were to cling like leeches to the frames of the bow windows, saying that, for his part, he liked to relieve the facade by a bit of decoration. Sir Harry hinted that a column, if possible, should be structural as well as decorative. Mr. Flack replied that all the columns had been ordered, adding in all the capitals different. One with dragons in the foliage, another approaching to the Ionian style, another introducing Mrs. Flack's initials. Everyone different. For he had read his Ruskin. He built his villas according to his desire. and not until he had inserted an immovable ant into one of them did Sir Harry buy. This futile and unprofitable transaction filled the knight with sadness as he leant on Mrs. Honeychurch's carriage. He had failed in his duties to the countryside, and the countryside was laughing at him as well. He had spent money, and yet Summer Street was spoilt as much as ever. All he could do now was to find a desirable tenant for Sissy. Someone really desirable. The rent is absurdly low, he told him, and perhaps I am an easy landlord. But it is such an awkward size. It is too large for the peasant class, and too small for anyone the least like ourselves. Cecil had been hesitating whether he should despise the villas or despise Sir Harry for despising him. The latter impulse seemed the more fruitful. You ought to find a tenant at once, he said maliciously. It would be a perfect paradise for a bank clerk. Perfect and community, or well-known favorite Liverpool. But exactly, said Sir Harry excitedly. That is exactly what I fear, Mr. Vyse. It will attract the wrong type of people. The train service has improved, a fatal improvement to my mind. And what are 5 miles from a station in these days of bicycles? Rather, a strenuous clerk they would be, said Lucy. Cecil, who had his full share of medieval mischievousness, replied that the physique of the lower middle classes was improving at a most appalling rate. She saw that he was laughing at their harmless neighbor, and roused herself to stop him. Sir Harry, she exclaimed, I have an idea. How would you like spinsters? My dear Lucy, it would be splendid. Do you know any such? Yes, I met them abroad. Gentlewoman? He asked tentatively. Yes, indeed. And at the present moment, homeless. Contrast. I heard from them last week, Miss Teresa and Miss Catherine Allen. I'm really not joking. They are quite the right people. Mr. Beebe knows them too. May I tell them to write to you? Indeed you may. He cried. Here we are, with the difficulty solved already. How delightful it is. Extra facilities. Please tell them they shall have extra facilities, for I shall have no agent's fees. Oh, the agents. The appalling people they have sent me. One woman, when I wrote a tactful letter, asking her to explain her social position to me, replied that she would pay the rent in advance. As if one cares about that. And several references I took up were most unsatisfactory, people swindlers, or not respectable. And, oh, the deceit. I have seen a good deal of the seamy side this last week. The deceit of the most promising people. My dear Lucy, the deceit. She nodded. My advice, put in Mrs. Honeychurch, is to have nothing to do with Lucy and her decayed gentlewoman at all. I know the type. preserve meat from people who have seen better days and bring heirlooms with them that make the house smell stuffy. It's a sad thing, but I'd far rather let to someone who is going up in the world than to someone who has come down. I think I follow you, said Sir Harry. But it is, as you say, a very sad thing. The Misses Allen aren't that, cried Lucy. Yes, they are, said Cecil. I haven't met them, but I should say they were a highly unsuitable addition to the neighborhood. Don't listen to him, Sir Harry. He's tiresome. It's I who am tiresome, he replied. I happen to come with my troubles to young people. But really, I am so worried, and Lady Otway will only say that I cannot be too careful, which is quite true, but no real help. Then may I write to my Mrs. Allen? Please. But his eye wavered when Mrs. Honeychurch exclaimed, Beware! They're certain to have canaries. Sir Harry, beware of canaries. They spit the seed out through the bars of the plages, and in the mice come. Beware of women altogether. Only let to a man, really. He murmured gallantly, though he saw the wisdom of her remark. Men don't gossip over teacups. If they get drunk, there is an end of them. They lie down comfortably and sleep it off. If they're vulgar, they somehow keep it to themselves. It doesn't spread so. Give me a man, of course, provided he's clean. Sir Harry blushed. Neither he nor Cecil enjoyed these open compliments to their sex. Even the exclusion of the dirty did not leave them much distinction. He suggested that Mrs. Honeychurch, if she had time, should descend from the carriage and inspect Sissy for herself. She was delighted. Nature had intended her to be poor, and to live in such a house. Domestic arrangements always attracted her, especially when they were on a small scale. Cecil pulled Lucy back as she followed her mother. Mrs. Honeychurch, he said, what if we two walk home and leave you? Certainly, was her cordial reply. Sir Harry likewise seemed almost too glad to get rid of them. He beamed at them knowingly, said, Aha! Young people, and then hastened to unlock the house. Hopeless Bulgarian, exclaimed Cecil, almost before they were out of earshot. Oh, Cecil, I can't help it. It would be wrong not to loathe that man. He isn't clever, but really he is nice. No, Lucy, he stands for all that is bad in country life. In London, he would keep his place. He would belong to a brainless club, and his wife would give brainless dinner parties. But down here, he acts the little god with his gentility and his patronage and his sham aesthetics, and everyone, even your mother, is taken in. All that you say is quite true, said Lucy, though she felt discouraged. I wonder whether matters so very much. It matters supremely. Sir Harry is the essence of that garden party. Oh, goodness. How cross I feel. How I do hope he'll get some vulgar tenant in that villa, some woman so really vulgar that he'll notice it. Gentlefolks. Gentlefolks. Ah, with his bald head and retreating chin. But let's forget him. This Lucy was glad enough to do. If Cecil disliked Sir Harry Otway and Mr. Beevy, what guarantee was there that the people who really mattered to her would escape? For instance, Freddie. Freddie was neither clever, nor subtle, nor beautiful. And what prevented Cecil from saying any minute, it would be wrong not to loathe Freddie? And what would she reply? Further than Freddie, she did not go. But he gave her anxiety enough. She could only assure herself that Cecil had known Freddie some time, and that they had always got on pleasantly, except perhaps during the last few days, which was an accident, perhaps. Which way shall we go? She asked him. Nature, simplest of topics, she thought, as around that Summer Street lay deep in the woods, and she had stopped where a footpath diverged from the high road. Are the two ways? Perhaps the road is more sensible. As we're got up smart. I'd rather go through the wood, said Cecil, with that subdued irritation that she had noticed in him all the afternoon. Why is it, Lucy, that you always say the road? Do you know that you have never once been with me in the fields or the wood since we were engaged? Haven't I? The wood, then, said Lucy, startled at his queerness, but pretty sure that he would explain later. It was not his habit to leave her in doubt as to his meaning. She led the way into the whispering pines, and sure enough, he did explain before they had gone a dozen yards. I'd got an idea, I dare say wrongly, but you feel more at home with me in a room. A room? She echoed, hopelessly bewildered. Yes, or at the most in a garden, or on a road. Never in the real country like this. Oh, Cecil, whatever do you mean? I have never felt anything of the sort. You talk as if I was a kind of poetess sort of person. I don't know that you aren't. I connect you with a view, a certain type of view. Why shouldn't you connect me with a room? She reflected a moment and then said, laughing, do you know that you're right? I do. I must be a poetess, after all. When I think of you, it's always as in a room. How funny. To her surprise, he seemed annoyed. A drawing room, pray, with no view. Yes, with no view, I fancy. Why not? I'd rather, he said, reproachfully, that you connected me with the open air. She said again, oh, Cecil, whatever do you need? As no explanation was forthcoming, she She shook off the subject as too difficult for a girl and led him further into the wood, pausing every now and then at some particularly beautiful or familiar combination of the trees. She had known the wood between Summer Street and Windy Corner ever since she could walk alone. She had played at losing Freddie in it when Freddie was a purple-faced baby, and though she had been to Italy, it had lost none of its charm. Presently, they came to a little clearing among the pines, another tiny green alp, solitary this time, and holding in its bosom a shallow pool. She exclaimed, "The sacred lake! Why do you call it that?" "I can't remember why. I suppose it comes out of some book. It's only a puddle now. But you see that stream going through it? Well, a good deal of water comes down after heavy rains and can't get away at once, and the pool becomes quite large and beautiful. Then Freddie used to bathe there. He's very fond of it." "And you?" He meant, "Are you fond of it?" But she answered dreamily, "I bathed here, too, till I was found out." Then there was a row. At another time, he might have been shocked, for he had depths of prudishness within him. But now, with his momentary cult of the fresh air, he was delighted at her admirable simplicity. He looked at her as she stood by the pool's edge. She was got up smart, as she phrased it, and she writes reminded him of some brilliant flower that has no leaves of its own, that blooms abruptly out of a world of green. "Who found you out?" "Charlotte," she murmured. "She was stopping with us." "Charlotte?" "Charlotte. Poor girl." She smiled gravely. A certain scheme from which hitherto he had shrunk now appeared practical. "Lucy!" "Yes, I suppose we ought to be going," was her reply. "Lucy, I want to ask something of you that I have never asked before." At the serious note in his voice, she stepped frankly and kindly towards him. "What, Cecil?" "Hitherto never. Not even that day on the lawn when you agreed to marry me." He became self-conscious and kept glancing round to see if they were observed. His courage had gone. "Yes? Up to now I've never kissed you." She was as scarlet as if he had put the thing most indelicately. "No. You have? More you have." She stammered. "Then I ask you, may I now?" "Of course you may, Cecil. You might before. I can't run at you, you know." At that supreme moment he was conscious of nothing but absurdities. Her reply was inadequate. She gave such a business-like lift to her veil. As he approached her, he found time to wish that he could recoil. As he touched her, his gold pince-nez became dislodged and was flattened between them. Such was the embrace. He considered with truth, but it had been a failure. Passion should believe itself irresistible. It should forget civility and consideration, and all the other curses of a refined nature. Above all, it should never ask for leave where there is a right of way. Why could he not do as any laborer or navvy? Nay, as any young man behind the counter would have done. He recast the scene. Lucy was standing flower-like by the water. He rushed up and took her in his arms. She rebuked him, permitted him, and revered him ever after for his manliness. For he believed that women revere men for their manliness. They left the pool in silence after this one salutation. He waited for her to make some remark which should show him her inmost thoughts. At last she spoke, and with fitting gravity. Emerson was the name, not Harris. What name? The old man's. What old man? That old man I told you about? The one Mr. Men was listened to, eager, was so unkind to. He could not know that this was the most intimate conversation they had ever had. The society out of which Cecil proposed to rescue Reese was perhaps no very splendid affair, yet it was more splendid than her antecedents entitled her to. Her father, a prosperous local solicitor, had built Windy Corner as a speculation at the time the district was opening up, and falling in love with his own creation, had ended by living there himself. Soon after his marriage, the social atmosphere began to alter. Other houses were built on the brow of that steep southern slope, and others again among the pine trees behind and northward on the chalk barrier of the downs. Most of these houses were larger than Windy Corner and were filled by people who came not from the district, but from London, and who mistook the Honeychurches for the remnants of an indigenous aristocracy. He was inclined to be frightened, but his wife accepted the situation without either pride or humility. I can't think what people are doing, she would say, but it is extremely fortunate for the children. She called everywhere. Her calls were returned with enthusiasm, and by the time people found out that she was not exactly of their milieu, they liked her, and it did not seem to matter. When Mr. Honeychurch died, he had the satisfaction, which few honest solicitors despise, of leaving his family rooted in the best society obtainable. The best obtainable. Certainly many of the immigrants were rather dull, and Lucy realized this more vividly since her return from Italy. Hitherto she had accepted their ideals without questioning, their kindly affluence, their inexplosive religion, their dislike of paper bags, orange peel and broken bottles. A radical out and out. She learnt to speak with horror of suburbia. Life, so far as she troubled to conceive it, was a circle of rich, pleasant people with identical interests and identical foes. In this circle, one thought, married, and died. Outside, it were poverty and vulgarity forever trying to enter, just as the London fog tries to enter the pine woods pouring through the gaps in the northern hills. But in Italy, where anyone who chooses may warm himself in equality, as in the sun, this conception of life vanished. Her senses expanded. She felt that there was no one whom she might not get to like, that social barriers were irremovable, doubtless, but not particularly high. You jump over them just as you jump into a peasant's olive yard in the Apennines, and he is glad to see you. She returned with new eyes. So did Cecil. But Italy had quickened Cecil, not to tolerance but to irritation. He saw that the local society was narrow, but instead of saying, "Does that very much matter?" he rebelled and tried to substitute for it the society he called broad. He did not realize that Lucy had consecrated her environment by the thousand little civilities that create a tenderness in time, and that though her eyes saw its defects, her heart refused to despise it entirely. Nor did he realize a more important point, that if she was too great for this society, she was too great for all society, and had reached the stage where personal intercourse would alone satisfy her. A rebel she was, but not of the kind he understood. A rebel who desired, not a wider dwelling room, but equality beside the man she loved. Her Italy was offering her the most priceless of all possessions, her own soul. Playing Bumble Puppy with Minnie Beebe, niece to the rector, and age 13, an ancient and most honorable game, which consists in striking tennis balls high into the air so they fall over the net. This sentence is confused, but the better illustrates Lucy's state of mind, for she was trying to talk to Mr. Beebe at the same time. Oh, it has been such a nuisance. First he, then they, no one knowing what they wanted, and everyone so tiresome. But they really are coming now, said Mr. Beebe. I wrote to Miss Teresa a few days ago. She was wondering how often the butcher called, and my reply of once a month must have impressed her favorably. They are coming. I heard from them this morning. I shall hate those Miss Allens. Mrs. Honeychurch cried. Just because they're old and silly, one's expected to say, how sweet. I hate their if, ing, and button, and ing. And poor Lucy, serve her right. One to a channel. Mr. Beatty watched the shadows springing and shouting over the tennis court. Cecil was absent. One did not play Bumble Puppy when he was there. Well, if they are coming. No, Minnie. Not Saturn. Saturn was a tennis ball whose skin was partially unsewn. When in motion, his orb was encircled by a ring. If they are coming, Sir Harry will let them move in before the 29th, and he will cross out the clause about whitewashing the ceilings because it made them nervous, and put in the fair wear and tear one. That doesn't count. I told you, not Saturn. Saturn's all right for Bumble Puppy, cried Freddie, joining them. Minnie, don't you listen to her? Saturn doesn't bounce. Saturn bounces enough. No, he doesn't. Well, he bounces better than the beautiful white devil. Hush, dear, said Mrs. Honeychurch. But look at Lucy, complaining of Saturn, and all the time's got the beautiful white devil in her hand, ready to plug it in. That's right, me. Go for her. Get her over the shins with the racket. Get her over the shins. Lucy fell. The beautiful white devil rolled from her hand. Mr. Beebe picked it up and said, "The name of this ball is Vittoria Corambona, please." But his correction passed unheeded. Freddie possessed to a high degree the power of lashing little girls to fury, and in half a minute he had transformed Minnie from a well-mannered child into a howling wilderness. Up in the house, Cecil heard them, and though he was full of entertaining news, he did not come down to impart it, in case he got hurt. He was not a coward, and bore necessary pain, as well as any man. But he hated the physical violence of the young. How right it was. Sure enough, it ended in a cry. "I wish the Miss Allens could see this," observed Mr. Beebe, just as Lucy, who was nursing the injured Minnie, was in turn lifted off her feet by her brother. "Who are the Miss Allens?" Freddie panted. "They have taken Sissy Villa." That wasn't the name. Here, his foot slipped, and they all fell most agreeably onto the grass. An interval elapses. "Wasn't what name?" asked Lucy, with her brother's head in her lap. "Allen wasn't the name of the people Sir Harry's let to." "Nonsense, Freddie. You know nothing about it." "Nonsense yourself." "I've this minute seen him. He said to me, 'Honeychurch, Freddie was an indifferent mimic. Absolutely awesome. Design. I have at last procured really desire rebel tenets.' I said, 'Hooray, old boy,' and slapped him on the back. Exactly. The Miss Allens? Rather not. More like Anderson." "Oh, good gracious. There isn't going to be another muddle." Mrs. Honeychurch exclaimed, "Do you notice, Lucy, I'm always right?" And I said, "Don't interfere with Sissy Villa. I'm always right." "I'm quite uneasy at being always right so often." "It's only another muddle of Freddie's. Freddie doesn't even know the name of the people he pretends have taken it instead." "Yes, I do. I've got it. Emerson." "What name?" "Emerson. I'll bet you anything you like." "What a weathercock Sir Harry is," said Lucy quietly. "I wish I had never bothered over it at all." And she lay on her back and gazed at the cloudless sky. Mr. Beebe. His opinion of her rose daily, whispered to his niece that that was the proper way to behave if any little thing went wrong. Meanwhile, the name of the new tenants had diverted Mrs. Honeychurch from the contemplation of her own abilities. "Emerson, Freddie? Do you know what Emersons they are?" "I don't know whether they're any Emersons, retorted Freddie, who was Democratic. Like his sister, and like most young people, he was naturally attracted by the idea of equality, and the undeniable fact that there are different kinds of Emersons annoyed him beyond measure. I trust they are the right sort of person. All right, Lucy. She was sitting up again. I see you looking down your nose and thinking your mother's a snob. But there's a right sort and a wrong sort, and it's affectation to pretend there isn't. Emerson's a common enough name, Lucy remarked. She was gazing sideways. Seated on a promontory herself, she could see the pine-clad promontories descending one beyond another into the yield. The further one descended the garden. The more glorious was this lateral view. I was merely going to remark, Freddie, that I trusted. They were no relations of Emerson, the philosopher, a most trying man. Pray, does that satisfy you? Oh yes, he grumbled. And you will be satisfied too, for they're friends of Cecil. So, elaborate irony, you and the other country families will be able to call in perfect safety. Cecil? Exclaimed Lucy. Don't be rude, dear, said his mother placidly. Lucy, don't screech. It's a new bad habit you're getting into. But has Cecil, friends of Cecil's, he repeated, and so really desire rebel. Honeychurch, I had just telegraphed to them. She got up from the grass. It was hard on Lucy. Mr. Beebe sympathized with her very much. While she believed that her snub about the Miss Allens came from Sir Harry Otway, he had borne it like a good girl. And she might well screech when she heard that it came partly from her lover. Mr. Vyse was a tease, something worse than a tease. He took a malicious pleasure in thwarting people. The clergyman, knowing this, looked at Miss Honeychurch with more than his usual kindness. When she exclaimed, "But Cecil's Emersons, they can't possibly be the same ones," there is that, he did not consider that the exclamation was strange, but saw it in an opportunity of diverting the conversation while she recovered her composure. He diverted it as follows. The Emersons who were at Florence. Do you mean? No, I don't suppose it will prove to be them. And it is probably a long cry from them to friends of Mr. Vyse's. Oh, Mrs. Honeychurch, the oddest people, the queerest people. For our part, we liked them, didn't we? He appealed to Lucy. There was a great scene over some violets. They picked violets and filled all the vases in the room of these very Miss Allens, who have failed to come to Sissy Villa. Poor little ladies. So shocked and so pleased. It used to be one of Miss Catherine's great stories. My dear sister loves flowers, it began. They found the whole room a mass of blue, vases and jugs, and the story ends with, so ungentlemanly and yet so beautiful. It is all very difficult. Yes, I always connect those Florentine Emersons with violence. But fiasco's done you this time, remarked Freddie, not seeing that his sister's face was very red. She could not recover herself. Mr. Beebe saw it and continued to divert the conversation. These particular Emersons consisted of a father and a son. The son, a goodly, if not a good young man, not a fool, I fancy, but very immature, pessimism, etc. Our special joy was the father, such a sentimental darling, and people declared he had murdered his wife. In his normal state, Mr. Beebe would never have repeated such gossip, but he was trying to shelter Lucy in her little trouble. He repeated any rubbish that came into his head. Murdered his wife, said Mrs. Honeychurch. Lucy, don't desert us. Go on playing Bumble Puppy. Really, the pension Bertolini must have been the oddest place. That's the second murderer I've heard of as being there. Whatever was Charlotte doing to stop? By the by, we really must ask Charlotte here some time. Mr. Beebe could recall no second murderer. He suggested that his hostess was mistaken. At the heat of opposition, she warned. She was perfectly sure that there had been a second tourist of whom the same story had been told. The name escaped her. What was the name? Oh, what was the name? She clasped her knees for the name. Something in Thackeray. She struck her matronly forehead. Lucy asked her brother whether Cecil was in. Oh, don't go. He cried and tried to catch her by the ankles. I must go, she said gravely. Don't be silly. You'll always overdo it when you play. As she left them, another shout of Harris shivered the tranquil air and reminded her that she had told a lie and had never put it right. Such a senseless lie, too. Yet it shattered her nerves and made her connect these Emersons, friends of Cecil's, with a pair of nondescript tourists. Hitherto truth had come to her naturally. She saw that for the future she must be more vigilant and be absolutely truthful. While at all events, she must not tell lies. She hurried up the garden, still flushed with shame. A word from Cecil would soothe her, she was sure. Cecil. Hello. And then, firm sanction to judgment. He just don't have these smoking limbs, and he seemed in high spirits. I was hoping you'd come. I heard you all bear gardening, but there's better fun up here. Even I have won a great victory for the comic muse. George Meredith's right. The cause of comedy and the cause of truth are really the same. And even I, have found tenants for the distressful Sissy Villa. Don't be angry. Don't be angry. You'll forgive me when you hear it all. He looked very attractive when his face was bright. And he dispelled her ridiculous forebodings at once. I have heard, she said, Freddie has told us. Naughty Cecil. I suppose I must forgive you. Just think of all the trouble I took for nothing. Certainly the Miss Allens are a little tiresome, and I'd rather have nice friends of yours. But you oughtn't to tease one so. Friends of mine? He laughed. Well, Lucy, their whole joke is to come. Come here. But she remained standing where she was. Do you know where I met these desirable tenants? In the National Gallery, when I was up to see my mother last week. What an odd place to meet people, she said nervously. I don't quite understand. In the Umbrian room, absolute strangers. They were admiring Luca Signorelli, of course, quite stupidly. However, we got talking, and they refreshed me not a little. They had been to Italy. But Cecil proceeded hilariously. In the course of conversation, they said that they wanted a country cottage, the father to live there, the son to run down for weekends. I thought, what a chance of scoring off Sir Harry, and I took their address and the London reference, found they weren't actual blackguards. It was Crete Sport, and wrote to him making out Cecil. Now, it's not fair. I've probably met them before. He bore her down. Perfectly fair. Anything is fair that punishes a snob. That old man will do the neighborhood a world of good. Sir Harry is too disgusting with his, quote, decayed gentlewomen. I meant to read him a lesson sometime. No, Lucy, the class is autumn next, and before long you'll agree with me. Well, there ought to be intermarriage. All sorts of things. I believe in democracy. No, you don't, she snapped. You don't know what the word means. He stared at her and felt again that she had failed to be Leonardesque. No, you don't. Her face was inartistic, that of a peevish virago. It isn't fair, Cecil. I blame you. I blame you very much indeed. You had no business to undo my work about the Miss Allens and make me look ridiculous. You call it scoring off Sir Harry, but do you realize that it is all at my expense? I consider it most disloyal of you. He left him. Temper. He thought, raising his eyebrows. No, it was worse than temper snobbishness. As long as Lucy thought that his own smart friends were supplanting the Miss Allens, she had not minded. Where he perceived that these new tenants might be of value educational. He would tolerate the father and draw out the son who was silent. In the interest of the comic muse and of truth, he would bring them to Windy Corner.